In this episode, we're going to be delving into a topic that no other history or political YouTuber has ever talked about before: the fabled United States party switch. A thing that literally every single pundit and historian was in complete agreement about until PragerU randomly just went, actually, and now for some reason, people actually question on whether or not it happened at all. And if me saying it didn't make it abundantly clear, yes, it did happen. Like, there is no question about whether or not it happened. The idea that the party switch, as it's called, didn't happen is just laughable. And as I've shown before, I'm not the first person to state this. However, there is one angle of this that I don't really see a lot of people talk about. You see, because most people, when they talk about the party switch, they usually go directly from Lincoln and the Republicans being founded to oppose slavery immediately to the 60s, where Republicans started advocating for the Southern strategy, usually just leaving it at that, which you'd think would simplify the picture easy enough for people who are not that intelligent to see it. However, it simplifies it too much that people who are not that smart start asking questions that this very simplified version cannot answer. And they will take that simplified version, then present it to their audience, and argue against this extremely simplified version, which they then use to argue for whatever political viewpoint they want. And even videos that do their best, they still leave some information out that I think is worth noting. I've deliberated long enough. Let's get into it. First, I'll answer a question that hopefully you guys should know if you're watching this video. What is the party switch? The party switch was basically the general idea that the Republican and Democratic parties switched platforms at some point during the 60s, particularly in regards to segregation, but also can be defined as generally the idea that the Democrats were originally more conservative and the Republicans were more liberal. But nowadays, that seems to be literally anything but. So naturally, people will say, oh, they switched sides. But I think one thing that we have to address is this idea of sides. Because we try to attribute the sides as political, like left versus right, but what was considered left and right back in the day would more than likely not be considered right and left nowadays. Especially very early on in the United States' life cycle, like we were just at the point of beginning the idea of partisan politics. Terms like right and left, or liberal progressive, or conservative were not really that well known. They were literally just beginning. Like very early on, somebody might identify as a liberal, but the way they governed might be more traditionally defined nowadays as a conservative, and vice versa. The reason why we call liberals left and conservatives right is literally because in a meeting of people of different political beliefs, they were told, sit on one side if you're for the monarchy, or sit on the other side if you're against the monarchy. So in that sense, wouldn't basically everybody in the United States be considered a liberal? There were really no broader political viewpoints that came from either of these ideas. And even if it did, it was literally just on paper and nothing more. Like Thomas Jefferson. He argued for liberty and freedom, except for enslaved black people. The real difference was not necessarily that much policy or ideological based, but rather in who they marketed to. And in order to do that, we have to go all the way back. All the way back to the Jeffersonians versus the Federalists. Jefferson and his rhetoric usually appealed a lot more to rural people, i.e. the South. Meanwhile, the Federalists argued in favor of more business-oriented solutions, so they appealed a lot more to the North. There were very few policy differences between the two. The biggest one I can think of is basically tariffs. And while in a modern day context, you might argue that tariffs are more of a left-wing issue, and right-wingers might be in favor of less tariffs, it was actually quite the opposite back then. Jefferson and his groups are usually portrayed as part of the left, while the Federalists would be argued to be part of the right. Now, I don't see any leftists nowadays arguing that they are in favor of Thomas Jefferson, but, again, this is at the time period. And this sort of Jeffersonian type of appeal would continue with Andrew Jackson, who would emulate Jefferson a lot and created the Democratic Party. So right off the bat, the Democrats have already become the leftward party. But again, we don't see many leftists arguing in favor of what Jackson was in favor of. And soon came the opposition from the newly created Whig Party, which again took up that mantle of the supposedly right-wing party. And the rhetoric is now starting to transition into actual policy differences, as Jackson became a huge critic of the National Bank and arguing in favor of the common man. Sounds like a lefty to me. And one of the ideas that Jackson really liked was the idea of universal suffrage for white men, which had an unintended consequence of expanding political thought. You see, up to this point, politics had essentially been defined as this group of rich white men versus this other group of rich white men, which, as you can probably guess, has a small Overton window. But now that voting power has expanded to people who don't own land and people who are not rich, now more issues can come to light that they actually care about. But what are they going to do when their options are rich white man 1 and rich white man 2? Well, they might turn to alternative parties, each with their own pet issue that will now be brought into the Overton window. Now you get introductions of issues that might be more familiar to modern day people. States' rights, hating on a specific religion. But one of the biggest things that expanded the Overton window was the idea of introducing the issue of slavery thanks to the Liberty and Free Soil parties. While originally very small, nobody really cared that much aside from like a specific subsection of the population, eventually it got too big to ignore. One group wanted to conserve a sacred institution, the other one wanted to liberate a group of people, and as such, what was originally considered the leftward party had now become the conservative party, and anybody who was on the other side of the issue would technically be placed to their left for being liberal on this issue, thus technically being the first party switch, albeit in basically name only. And as you can piece together, this kind of became the status quo of US politics for at least Reconstruction, because in the immediate aftermath of Reconstruction, things started shifting again, albeit slightly, with the introduction of the People's Party, a group that appealed to the same rural southern base that the Democrats did, but by introducing a new issue that directly affected them, currency reform. And pretty soon, the People's Party essentially either took over or was taken over by the Democratic Party, whichever definition you prefer. Essentially the same thing happened. People's Party mostly merged within the Democrats. But all it did was just add more voices to the pot. Broadly, the Democrats were still technically the rightward party, and usually come presidential election time, they ran the rightward candidate, the only exception being William Jennings Bryan's 3 runs, which compelled the GOP to shift right. But again, mostly staying within their specific areas, Northerners and Southerners. But things did not truly start beginning to shift drastically until the 1912 election. The left and right wings of both parties were fighting for control of them. One was considered successful and one was considered a failure. The ones that failed saw they had more momentum than the conservative wing, so they decided to go into the election solo. Democrats, however, remained unified behind their arguably left of choice, and they went to the White House. And due to this, we started seeing the inklings of what would become the idea of like the Democrats being on the left and the Republicans being on the right again, as the conservatives basically had the ability to solidify their power within their party. There were notable exceptions, like a lot of the Democratic senators within the South, while having sort of left-ish rhetoric on certain economic issues, would still probably be considered right-wing given their racial issues or their cultural issues. But the Washington Consensus was not really in the issue of civil rights yet, so again, it did seem like the Democrats were more left, or the Republicans were more right, but barely, as the two candidates could technically be considered interchangeable, and sometimes they legitimately were. However, this became completely solidified by the early 30s with the rise of FDR. Now, FDR was not in the same vein of liberal as previous liberals. The term liberal had started to shift a little bit, and one of the big things that shifted in regards to it was that they had to address certain economic issues. And one of the things that had to come from this was actually working with people that you wouldn't even expect someone like FDR to work with. Communists and socialists, which were brought in to his New Deal coalition, which united a ton of people based on basic economic principles that they felt were justified. Again, including those group of some Southern Democrats that would be considered more right-wing on social issues. And this pretty much very early on solidified the Democrats as being the full-on leftward party in the US. And as long as FDR kept bringing this coalition together, everything would be fine. And he kept it up for a good while, but it didn't end up lasting, as after his death, the coalition crumbled thanks to a certain issue that has come back to plague politics. By 1948, the issues of civil rights and segregation were starting to become too big to ignore. While FDR had a good old big economic crash to distract people from it, Truman was not so lucky, and he actually had to do some addressing of the issue. In order to keep his coalition together, he decided to go and try to do some small menial reforms that wouldn't anger the rightward Dixiecrats. However, that didn't help, and that group got super mad, even with his milquetoast reforms, particularly a Democrat by the name of Strom Thurmond, who decided to run an independent campaign against Truman, and a couple states in the Deep South literally chose to forego Truman and make Strom the official Democratic nominee. What was the issue that got him mad? Desegregating the military. Racism took a bit of a hiatus from being the forefront issue, but now it's back in the spotlight. Now, the Dixiecrats didn't end up spoiling the election, but that map that shows those deep blue areas suddenly not be blue anymore was a kick in the keister to try and remind the Democrats, don't forget the base. And forget the base they did not, because they kept trying to keep them satiated by, again, ignoring the segregation and civil rights issue, and always trying to make sure that at least somebody who represented either the interests or was directly from the South was on the ticket. Going back to an era where both parties had rightward and leftward people, because remember, just because segregation wasn't explicit in the North doesn't mean it didn't exist. However, for some members of the Southern Democrats, nominating a Catholic Massachusetts liberal was just a bit too much, and a couple of faithless electors decided to go and vote for someone named Harry F. Byrd, a Democratic senator from the South. These two states pledging to vote for a ticket of Byrd and Thurmond, but this guy in Oklahoma did something interesting and voted for a bipartisan ticket of Byrd and a little-known senator from Arizona by the name of Barry Goldwater. And thanks to a guy from Alabama, the issue of segregation was finally too big to ignore, and now we have to have an explicit approval or disapproval of segregation. For most Republicans, it was pretty easy. Democrats had to do a lot of convincing within their own ranks to do so. But with bipartisan approval, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. Dixiecrats were not happy about it. Again, most prominently, Strom Thurmond, the OG Dixiecrat, making the drastic move to join the Republican Party and support their nominee against Lyndon B. Johnson. Who was their nominee? Barry Goldwater, who was already familiar with the Dixiecrats with that aforementioned Byrd elector. And the Dixiecrats rewarded Goldwater by giving him the 5 states in the Deep South. A very drastic move, considering this was the first election Georgia didn't vote for a Democrat since 1852. It was pretty clear things were starting to change in regards to the politics of the two parties. The following election further cemented it, with another prominent Dixiecrat, George Wallace, deciding to run as a third-party candidate to further cement the Dixiecrats' independence from the Democratic Party, spewing explicit white supremacist rhetoric. Meanwhile, Republican nominee Richard Nixon saw an opportunity. He saw that there were a lot of Southern Democrats that were now very much against the Democratic Party. So he thought it would be best to try and appeal to these voters. But he had to do it in a more subtle approach. him and his campaign staff creating something called the Southern Strategy to appeal to the more conservative Democrats. While not explicitly campaigning as a racist, he would use dog whistles to appeal to them. Rather than saying, "I want to jail all these black protesters," he would instead campaign on law and order. And Nixon had the perfect opportunity to execute this strategy because he could deflect any criticisms of racism by saying, "Look at me and look at Wallace, who's the racist?" And Wallace actually was able to help with this strategy, not just for good deflection, but also to make Democrats less likely to vote for the Democrat, exert more political independence. While Nixon might not be able to get those voters this time, maybe in the next election, they might be more likely to vote for Nixon. And in the next election, I think it kind of worked. Around this time, we also got the Fourth Great Awakening, which led to a rise in evangelical Christianity across the nation, which of course led to a rise in conservatism within the US. And naturally, they wanted to translate this momentum into politics. So they started getting politically active. And most of the leaders were sort of mixed politically, but soon a figure rose up to be the face of the new conservative movement from every angle, and 1980 had officially solidified the party switch by having Ronald Reagan pretty much run any remaining left to center left leaning Republicans out of the party in favor of explicitly right-wing conservatives. While most would probably close the book there, there's a little bit more of the story, as the GOP's successful rightward shift made the Democrats follow suit within the 90s with the rise of the Third Way New Democrat strategy, basically opening the doors to those moderate conservatives to join with the Democrats. And pretty soon, we got more shifts within the 2010s with the rise of the Tea Party. And then Democrats started shifting again to be more leftward. My point in bringing all this stuff up after the fact, outside of the main party switch that we know of, is to solidify one basic fact. The idea that the party switch didn't happen is ludicrous because the parties switch every couple of years. They change their policies, they change their platforms, their bases shift to become different parties. The Democratic Party of today is vastly different than the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson. And the Republican Party nowadays is vastly different from the Republican Party that Lincoln fought for. And also to show the idea of a singular switch being very ludicrous to define it as well, because, as I said, it switches a lot. Anyways, thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to notify when the future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.